flipping the table.
This is Michael, and it's Season 2 of Flipping the Table. This is a podcast featuring honest conversations about food, farming, and the future. I do this because I'm inspired by all the people you will hear. Some of them I've known for decades, and others I've just met. But each of them are creating the knowledge, the food enterprises, farms, and ranches that will make for a future that works better for us all. Here I am, 24 days into sheltering in place in Santa Rosa, California, in my home, and going to bring you a new episode of Flipping the Table with Jim Araby from the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. And to set up for that, it's important to know that there are over 21 million people, that is 1 out of every 7 workers in the U.S., ensure that Americans can eat every day. And these are what we call our food chain workers. There's those good folks, those hardworking people who bring the food from the field to the table. And they're on the ranches, they're on the farms, they're in the processing plants, the distribution centers, the cafeterias and restaurants, and grocery stores, of course. And the food chain workers are actually the largest segment of employees in the nation, but they're also the lowest paid. And now we're facing the COVID-19 pandemic, which has put millions of these workers from the restaurants and food service sector out of business. They're unemployed, and they've joined those long lines of about 10 million people trying to get unemployment insurance. And then there's a whole other group that are still at risk, or at a lot of risk, because they're in the grocery store serving us every day. And we're starting to read now, and some of you have seen either read or seen on television the fact that these grocery store workers are beginning to die from the disease, which is a tragic thing. So it's really appropriate that we're going to focus on food chain workers today. And I actually know of no better person to do that with than Jim Araby. And he is the Strategic Campaigns Director for UFCW Local 5 here in Northern California. And prior to that, he actually was the executive director of the Western States Council, which is composed of 185,000 UFCW workers from 3 states, California, Arizona, and Nevada. And in both his role as the campaign director and before that, when he was the executive director for the 3 states, he's been kind of central to all of the political and legislative efforts of the organization. And he's been part of the leadership that has brought some first-in-the-nation laws like paid sick days, banning plastic bags, and then worker retention in the grocery industry, which is how I came to know him. He invited Richard Chains to become a co-sponsor of the grocery worker retention bill several years ago. And also he's been very involved in medical marijuana and the cannabis industry. You'll hear about that. And trying to bring more health and safety for the workers who work in that industry. Also has worked very closely with the retail pharmacy workers, and has also been a supporter of the sweetened beverage tax, because what's good for his customers and is good for his workers. So, with such a background, it's clear that he is part of what I would call the new labor movement. And so today we're going to discuss first of all, what's going on with the pandemic and how he's working and how the unions are working to protect those frontline grocery store workers and retail workers and folks out in the fields. And then also we're going to talk about what's going on in labor generally in the United States and the challenges in improving the lives of workers in the modern age. So with that, let's begin. Jim, welcome. Good to see you healthy. We're reaching you at your office. And so let's just dive in. My first question, what's being done to protect the grocery workers, the gig workers who are delivering food, and the men and women who are out in the fields right now?
I think you're seeing a very inconsistent ad hoc approach that's happening across the food supply chain. I think if we start with workers that are represented by unions, we've secured some of the strongest protections and measures to put in place for workers. You know, right when this pandemic first started, we immediately reached out to our largest employer, Albertson Safeway, spent about 4 days intensely negotiating with them. That created a range of protections for our members. And I would say the top four things are, immediate access to paid leave, that that would allow for them if they themselves have been diagnosed, or they have a family member that's at high risk, or if they have childcare issues, or they had to be quarantined, they would have immediate access to 14 days of paid leave, and then from there it would cascade at different levels of benefit that they have already had access to in their contract. Paid sick time, vacation time, and then going on either workers' comp or unemployment, depending on the situation. That was a big thing we won. We also won, immediate enforcement of social distancing measures in the store, plexiglass for workers, able to wear PPE, able to, go step away and wash their hands every 30 minutes, able to have access to hand sanitizer. We rolled out a series of different things, as well as sort of an efficient hotline if in case in individual stores things weren't happening, where we then can communicate directly with management, and management would react. I would say this has been probably the most collaborative moment we've had for the most part with our employers, because the health and safety of their workers, the health and safety of customers is an extension of that, is immediately urgent. I think if you look from there to other parts of the food supply chain that aren't unionized, it's a very inconsistent approach, and you can even see it with what workers were doing. Amazon workers, going out, in New York to do a work stoppage to demand changes. Trader Joe's workers, demanding, saying that the company isn't moving fast enough. Whole Foods workers, right? So you have all the series of these non-union workers.
They're going on strike, basically, haven't they? Been walking
What
out.
was that?
Walking out, right?
Yeah, and I don't think is obviously, given the sort of economic uncertainty that we're in right now, with 10 million new people claiming unemployment in the last 2 weeks. I think it was hard for a lot of workers to participate in that, but just the sort of elevation of that story, and that enough workers would take a risk, show you that there wasn't as consistent of approach. Then you have some employers, trying to figure it out. Walmart, to an extent, was sort of saying they're going to take everyone's temperature before they come into work, and they're putting in these certain measures. Amazon, to a lesser extent, was saying the same thing. But again, I think you see, without any sort of voice at the workplace, things coming from the top down, and the fear that's being moved. I think it was there's a very inconsistent approach, around what they're trying to do, what companies are doing. And then I would say the last thing is, and that and we've been working and advocating at the same time, with the government, both at the state, local, and national level, to create protections for these, frontline workers that are seen as essential.
Yeah. Well, the I noticed that the I think it's the Times, the New York Times or the Washington Post reported on the deaths of some grocery workers, and those seem to be at Walmart and other. Have any unionized retailers lost people to the virus?
There's been a couple. We had a member at a local grocery store in San Jose that passed away early on in this epidemic. I think to be honest, it's really, but I would say the instances that have been reported are much higher at non-union stores than union stores. But that being said, I also think it's hard to quantify the actual impact of this virus currently around, people both contracting it at the sites as well as dying from it, because, we through the federal government did not take this seriously until the beginning of March, and the first cases appeared in early January. And, who knows who had what, between January and March, and what was really being reported prior to the attention really being paid to this.
Yeah.
But I will say, from our perspective, we're doing everything we can to ensure the health and safety and protection of our workers, and also making sure that they um, they accrue some other benefit for this. Grocery sales are up 73%, since last quarter because of the way that people
People are
go to the
hoarding.
grocery store.
Yeah,
What was that?
people are hoarding.
Yeah, people are hoarding, and I think there's a lot of panic buying going on, and then scarcity economics, right? When people think that things are in short supply, they go out and buy more of them.
Right. So I don't know if everything you've been talking about in terms of what you have secured for the workers within UFCW, what about field workers? What's going on? I know that there was real concern that those folks who are harvesting or in the packing
Yeah.
shed would be at risk. Are you hearing anything or working on that area at all?
Yeah, we are. So we represent, our union does represent about, a couple thousand farm workers and food processing workers. And, the challenge for that is, how do you properly social distance in the field? As you see in the fields, people are working hand in hand next to each other. And then also just think about when they get picked up, from the sort of labor camps and driven to the farms, right? Some people have their own transportation, but a lot of folks take buses.
Yeah.
And they're packing in 10, 12 in a tight little van.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of concern. We've been working with in California, the Department of Industrial Relations, to really come up with a criteria to put in place to protect agricultural workers. It's a lot more difficult, to be quite honest, than it is sort of in the retail site.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we're trying the best we can to advocate for this. It's been a lot more inconsistently applied in the ag sector. And, the problem is these workers have always faced this challenge where they're not the ones that you see every day. And so the stories of infection, these are also poorer workers. They have less access to healthcare, right? They're actually more difficult for them to properly social distance because they probably, some of them live, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to a house.
Yeah, understand. Yeah, that's tough. I do have a lot of concern for their welfare, well, generally, but particularly now. And this is interesting because this pandemic, I mean, this has not really happened at this level in the United States since, the influenza epidemic in 1918. So I'm curious about moving into this conversation about the labor movements, the changes in the labor movement, since I see you as someone who's part of the kind of new labor, has a broader understanding about what you can do as a union for workers in general. So why don't you talk about what, the evolution of labor over the last, 50, 60 years and where you are, your frame when you think about workers?
Yeah. Well, I think, the economy's structure and shape is very different today than it was 60 years ago. I think coming out of World War II and the post-war industrial boom, that was really generated by two things. One, very large government interaction in the industrial economy because of the war economy. And then, you had much less competition, in terms of, the sort of industrial goods because you had the underdeveloped or undeveloped, sort of South, right? And then you had Western Europe decimated, right? In Asia decimated, in terms of their industrial capacity. So, you had very high value, and high value industrial economy in the United States. And because of that, you also had high union density, right? Because the government in the 1940s, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, basically said to industrial companies, you are going to have labor peace. You're not going to fight the unions, or you don't get government contracts. We need labor peace. We need things delivered quickly. And so that's really the untold story of labor's growth in the private sector from the 1930s through the 1940s. And then you sort of see a couple things happen post-war that sort of reshape industrial relations in the United States. One is in 1947, you see the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act that was overrode a presidential veto that sort of undermined unions' ability to actually, collectively bargain and organize. And then you also see in the 50s and 60s, Europe sort of growing again through the Marshall Plan. But then also you see, really the sort of beginnings of what becomes free trade, where you have, more and more of the global South industrializing, more sort of multinational, organizations rising up. And then the other piece, you see the third piece of this is you see after Taft-Hartley, a lot of things related to undermining our ability under the National Labor Relations Act to be able to organize workers. So all these sort of congruence of forces happen that, labor reaches its peak in 1954 when one out of every three workers in the private sector in the United States is in a labor union. And then you fast forward to today in 2020, and you have less than 10% of the private sector, organized. A couple things did happen in between, where a shift of, organized labor in the private sector to the public sector workers, basically most famously with Martin Luther King and the garbage workers strike in Tennessee in 1963 and the I Am a Man, sort of movement that sort of crosses with the civil rights movement to really raise up, the voices of public sector workers. So public sector growth happens, explosively in the 60s and 70s as the private sector unionization rate goes down. So you see this sort of transition of an industrial economy to a service economy, and then more of labor being in the sort of public sector than the private sector. And that changes the way that labor works. I think, within certain industries, in the private sector, there was still some strength of labor, including the industry we represent, the grocery industry, even through the 90s, where you still had pretty high union density. In the meatpacking industry and food processing industry, pretty still high union density. But outside of that, you don't really have a lot of growth. You do have some in the 90s and early 2000s as SEIU started concentrating on organizing janitors and healthcare. But it's very hard. And then, you see these blips like the farm workers movement in the 60s, in California at least, where, by 1977, 150,000 farm workers are in a union in California, but that doesn't spread across the country. There's some in Arizona, in Florida, but outside of that, there's really farm workers still have no rights to organize and collectively bargain. And so, that's all to say. So there's been a lot of challenges as we enter into the dawn of the 21st century. But at the same time, I think the United States labor relations model coming out of the post-war economy versus Europe and other industrialized nations, American business interests decided that labor was an obstacle to growth, and so you see a very aggressive move by American business to kill labor, whereas in Europe, in Canada, and even in Latin America, there's a very different relationship amongst labor unions, so that density still remains fairly high. In Europe, it's still at about 30% of private sector workers are in a union. In Canada, it's about the same. The Latin America, it varies, but it's much higher. So it's a lot different. The labor model in the United States is a lot different. So
it does seem to me that's a reflection generally. I had a conversation recently with Dave Henson from the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. We were talking about basically the really bad policy around food and health and the environment in the United States, which is a reflection, an artifact of the power of corporations. And the government's basically taking the side of capital versus the common person in the country. And so I mean, obviously this is a very similar pattern, right? We've got, I remember Reagan busted the union for the air traffic controllers back in the 80s. And it's just been one thing after another, I know, with these decisions. And so, the question in my mind is, are we, I mean, with the rise of Bernie and Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren, do you think there's an inkling of a need to rejigger that balance of power, corporations versus workers?
100%, absolutely think so. I think a lot of the industrial and economic policies of the 70s, 80s, 90s, even 2000s, even before we hit this pandemic crisis, which sort of really revealed the underbelly of American politics and the economy, were the most vulnerable, are also the most vital.
They're also dying at the highest. I mean, it's the paper about African American communities, low income communities. They're dying way more.
I mean, we represent, workers that are deemed essential, but you can also say they're disposable, right? Because they're the ones that have, I mean, our members are lucky enough, they have access to healthcare, they have some level of benefit, they have some level of security for themselves, but we're still only talking 1 out of every 4 grocery workers in the country is in a union. So the other 75% are not. And, they have very minimal access to benefits, if anything at all. They're the ones that are the least ability to socially distance. They can't work from home, right? They have to work, right? And then if you look at the broader sense, the sort of shedding of jobs in the United States, in the last 2 weeks, where, the economy's contracted at 30%, we have 10 million people unemployed. Well, the billionaires only lost money in the stock market. So if the billionaires and trickle down economics actually worked, wouldn't the billionaires just have to spend money and then the economy wouldn't shrink? So clearly, the productivity and gains of this economy have gone to the top 1% of the 1%, and yet the economy is driven by the bottom 99%, right? And so I think we're very much at a moment where we could capitalize on that and really shake the consciousness of people to a point where they feel empowered to make a change. And I think you saw some of that, happening in the sort of pre-pandemic discussion around the Democratic nomination. But even on the right, I mean, Trump himself is a right-wing populist that is, echoing these sort of concerns, racially tinged, obviously, but like echoing concerns of the haves and the have-nots in a very different way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Today is the day that that Bernie dropped out of the race. So what's your feeling about Mr. Biden? Is if he were to be elected, do you think you could see some change in law? And let's say the Democrats took the Senate and kept the House. Do you think you'd actually see some change in the law around labor relations, labor policy?
We have to demand it. I mean, I think it was. I think Bernie's a fascinating case study in sort of the sort of bipolar effect of progressive politics, right? Because I think if you take Bernie out of the equation and you really take his message, you look. I mean, he and his movement, and I would argue Elizabeth Warren before him, who then ceded it to him, and then tried to get back on it after, because she was really the first populist if you think about, the financial crisis in 2009, 2010, it was really Elizabeth Warren, creating the Consumer Financial Bureau, going after banks, even before that, the bankruptcy bill, like all these different things. She was really out there. She gets elected to the Senate, takes a seat back. Bernie sort of captures that movement. But, this combination, progressives really have taken a hold of the narrative, the counter narrative in the last 4 years. And Bernie and his movement and his followers, and I really do believe it is a movement, along with Elizabeth Warren and Alexia Ocasio-Cortez and everyone that's sort of come out of this movement, should take credit for changing the debate, the terms of the debate. And I think while it's hard to predict, anyone that tells you, especially the time that we're in right now, because we don't even know what it's going to look like in a few months, I think Biden has no choice. Democrats have no choice. They have to think about moving sort of the policy agenda of the federal government in a real populist progressive manner. I mean, who would have thunk it even 2 months ago that President Trump would sign a stimulus bill that had $2 trillion, pumped into the economy. And they're already talking about a second stimulus package that's $1 trillion. In 2008, 2009, when Hank Paulson, remember that famous thing when Hank Paulson got in front of Congress right after John McCain said the fundamentals of the economy are strong, got in and said we need to pump $850 billion into the economy. We need to save the banks. And that was a big thing. Robert Reich was out talking about how the stimulus should have been 1.4 trillion, right? And here we are today, fast forward, we're now talking about 2 trillion plus, right?
I have friends who come out of the financial world who are saying it's going to be up to 6-7 trillion by the end to keep the economy afloat.
Yeah, I mean, if progressives and Democrats and sort of, people that think that federal intervention, government intervention in the economy, only will save it. If we can't capture this moment, then we should just all go home. Just all go home. If unions can't organize in this moment, right? If unions can't really show that their advocacy for workers, and then what are we doing, right? We shouldn't exist, so the onus is on us.
Yeah.
to capture that.
Yep. So I want to switch topics a little bit. I want to talk to you about, one of the challenges we always have in the food sector is that people want cheap food, which keeps the price down. I know in the farming world, one of the few places that farmers have control over their costs is labor. And so they always end up being kind of in this struggle with labor over how much labor gets paid, how much a field worker or a processor gets paid. And so when you think about this dilemma of cheap food and trying to give workers a fair wage and other compensation, forms of compensation, how do you deal with that dilemma in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's so I'm going to sort of try to take this a different way. The greatest, I always have fear of when I'm a labor person, even though I think it makes sense, is when you talk about efficiencies, because efficiencies means sort of, lowering costs. But I also think you can flip that on its head and say, if you can create maximal efficiency of workers through training, through really smart industrial planning, in an agricultural setting, that you can workers can be maximally efficient and gain from those efficiencies if you increase productivity, right? And I always think about like the people that work, the lettuce fields, like a very talented, picking and packaging lettuce is like one of the toughest jobs out there, right? We have members that do that, and you can have someone that can cut so many heads of lettuce per shift. It varies greatly, but partly it varies because the skills necessary to actually be able to make the cut, flip it, put it in the barrel. And I think, you think about more about doing that. Maybe you can still you can scale production in a way where people can, gain from that. I also think, let's be honest, as technology comes into play, and the availability of technology, I think you're going to have to think about how we transition into a different type of a food economy as it relates to where labor is concentrated.
Mm-hmm.
Culture, and I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have some sense of it. Agriculture over the last few years, because of restrictive immigration policies and others, has actually had a huge, and then competition with cannabis cultivation in a lot of places has had there's been a labor shortage, right? And
huge right now, really tough.
Yeah, so with any labor shortage, the cost of labor goes up, right? Because it's market economics, right? If there's less of a supply and a great demand, then you're able to demand more money. And so I think, but at the same time, I know the bigger agriculture, and I think this is where even another federal intervention and state intervention has to happen, where they can give loans to small farmers to be able to get access to the newer technologies to create higher productivity, is all going to be important. And I think on the other end, the labor gets pushed down the chain of the supply chain, right? You're going to have, larger distribution networks, more packaging, networks. And then on the retail side, the selling of food, the creation of food, all of that, that's, I think, where maybe some of the labor supply gets pushed. I think is important, so that to me is like, my long-winded explanation saying
efficiency. What you're saying is
technology,
training of workers, technologies,
the
way to do it.
Yeah. I think that's what you got to do.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think it actually coincides with some of the things I'm hearing. I had a podcast a while back, conversation with Don Cameron, one of the biggest growers from the Central Valley, who's also the president of the State Board of Food Ag. Very thoughtful man, a good grower environmentally, and talks about providing opportunities, training with the new technologies that are coming into farming to allow farm workers to increase skills and get paid like tech workers eventually.
Absolutely.
As they become more skilled at technological tools that they use to grow food. So I think there's a lot of overlap there. That's nice to hear. So I want to talk now about, the kind of go back to, because when I asked you about new labor, modern labor approach, you didn't really get into the work that you've been doing with cannabis workers and others who aren't actually unionized.
Right.
The work that you're doing, I mean, that to me, it used to be that and I could be wrong, so you can correct me, but it seemed to me that unions were just about working with their people and trying to get more people to join their union, and that was the whole focus. And um, it seems, when I've talked to you, there seems to be more of an openness to just move labor forward. In a broader sense, is this in fact true? And this will get us into what your work with cannabis.
Like any organization, if you don't grow, you die, right? And I think, on a sort of macro level, the experience of our union is we understand a retail supply chain. We understand how to represent workers across a retail supply chain. And then when we look at cannabis is a commodity, that has a very similar supply chain as any other retail product. And so we looked at that and said that's an opportunity for our union to continue to grow and maybe try to align ourselves to use the sort of the current sort of institutional power that we have politically and on the policy end to maybe try to align ourselves with and try to reshape labor relations with owners in another retail commodity supply chain industry. Mm-hmm. And so we've been doing that for the last decade. It's been interesting because the whole shape of the cannabis industry is dramatically changing. But the good thing, at least from our vantage point,
for listeners, that means it used to be a lot of small growers all up and down the state of California, other places who are consolidating and shrinking as the legalization process is underway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's also just a transition from an unregulated market to a regulated market, right? And a consistently regulated market. And it's still in the midst of that transition. It's also in a spot where the regulated market is still competing with an unregulated market, so the price differences are great. And then the sort of speculative nature of a new business that happened in 2016, 17, and 18 collapsed in 2019. So the amount of money that was available to sort of subsidize expansion has really shrunk up.
Yeah.
And there's very few that actually have access to capital at the number that they need to even survive, right? And so it's been tricky. If you were to talk to me when we had this conversation over a year ago, mm-hmm. even then the market has really changed. And when people think about labor, we do add, when you have an organized workforce, there's an added cost to that. It's harder from the business perspective to manage your labor costs because you no longer can make unilateral decisions. You actually have to negotiate right. that labor cost. And I think, and also with the increasing participation of private equity, privately managed capital funds, the traditional sort of capital markets coming into marijuana, the marijuana industry, the relationship between labor and those employers has become more tense.
Yeah.
But the good thing is it's a highly regulated market, much more so than most other commodity markets when it comes to, how you package it to how you sell it to where you sell it, that we still can have a very big effect and impact in the industry because of our political relationships and our, relationships within the regulatory bodies that exist. So I think, there's still an ability for us to have leverage. Just it's a very different spot.
Yeah, that is interesting how things have changed in just over a year. That's true. And it seems to me it's going to take a while to shake out, where the industry is going to go and who's going to survive. One thing that I wanted to touch on that you said that raised a thought that kind of gets us to where I want to end. the this pandemic, and you said it at the beginning of the conversation, you said you've seen more collaboration between owners and operators and labor than you have in a very long time because of the pandemic, people trying to keep people alive and healthy, and basically deal with the crisis.
Mhm.
Um, and you said in the cannabis situation, there was a time when it was more mom and pops. There might have been better relations between the workers than there are when the big corporations come in. But are you hopeful that in the midst of this crisis, there's an understanding of the need for mutuality, the need for collaboration? I mean, think about living in the Bay Area. I live in Sonoma County, as you know, where you've spent a lot of time through the years. I've had to leave my home on 3 occasions due to 2 occasions I had to go away. What's the word I'm looking for? I had to evacuate.
Yeah.
One time I had to stay in my house for 6 days because there was so much smoke coming down from Paradise. I mean, now we have this. We had floods. I mean, we have droughts. It's like, Jesus Christ, what's happening in the world? So does this create a context for us realizing we're all in it to freaking together and we got to do something differently? And will that empower the labor movement?
One would hope. I think I always think of the Naomi Klein book. She wrote a book. I forget the name of it, but Naomi Klein wrote a pretty famous
Was it the one
shock
about
doctrine,
shock doctrine?
right? I think we're in the midst of that, and I think there are a ton of different factors that are going to determine whether we get out of this in one way or not. I mean, I think there's generational divides around sort of what we're looking at. I think there's an incredible amount of misinformation that's out there in terms of, that skews people's political perspective. I also think the biggest challenge is, in my mind, is and I think we talked about this at the beginning, how our political economy is currently constructed. Our political economy is currently constructed to deal with short-range problems. On the economic side,
quarterly problems.
huh?
Quarterly.
Yeah, exactly. So on the investor side, it's like, it's not about what happens in the long term, it's about what happens in the next quarter, right? And that's even more exacerbated by machine-driven investments, right? So when you see those wild swings in the economy, a lot of it has to do with AI, predicting, what's going to happen. And so there's these massive swings, of profit and loss within minutes, right? So we're whipsawed by a quarterly approach to our economy. We're also whipsawed by our electoral approach in politics, right? That is just the next campaign. It's the next, decisions are driven by the next campaign. And we really don't have real leadership on the sort of outside in a real way, because we have organizations and institutions that have, sort of dissolved or are going through their own reformation. And so I think it's a clear moment where new leadership has to arise to push, a long-term objective, right? We can no longer think quarter by quarter. We can no longer think election by election. I'm not fooling myself that isn't taken into effect. But if we're really dealing with these issues, we got to deal with them on a very holistic, systemic, long-term approach. And that means reorganizing our society, right? My fear is, and I wrote about this, the piece that I, put out there, is like, pandemic has unmasked the dirty underbelly of the American ecosystem. And, if we don't use this as a way to understand how to approach other long-term problems, the next virus is not one in which is going to impact. It's already out there. That virus is climate change. And if we don't deal with how to reorganize our society to take into account this other thing that's going on and has been going on, which is climate change, then we're all totally, then what are we doing, right?
I mean, what's the future for the kids otherwise?
I mean, what's the future period, right?
And
And
have to do this. Yeah.
and I think it's up to all of us, and this is where it drives me every day. It's up to all of us to understand our role in that as we move ahead, right? And to push our own institutions or organizations, to push ourselves, right? To push others to really think more broadly. Like, yes, we have short-term problems, but we got to both be on the dance floor and at the balcony at the same time. And if we don't know how to do both, and we don't have enough leaders that are thinking that way, and we don't sort of take ourselves out of our own ideological construct to think a more holistic approach to this, then I don't know what we do. And I'd say the opportunity for unions the opportunity for unions is we can't be just about bread and butter issues. We can't just be about wages and benefits. We got to tell the story of what we do every day differently. And I think this pandemic has allowed us to talk about when workers have a voice, we protect the health and safety of workers, we protect the health and safety of customers coming into our stores. We are the advocates for the individuals. We are not driven by the quarter. We are not driven by an electoral process. We are fundamentally driven by how our members, and more broadly, how the people that interact with our members are protected and are safe and can actually benefit from, their interaction. That's our job, and I think the more we can display that and provide hope and articulate that vision, I think the better we'll be.
That sounds right. And we've come to the end of our hour, our 45 minutes, but I wanted to thank you. As always, you've done a beautiful job talking about your important work. And I'm really glad to see you're healthy and to hear your family's healthy. And thank you for what you're doing for the food chain workers of this country. We need them to remain healthy on the front line so we can survive this as we all shelter in place. So thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Take care.
Bye.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.